I was thinking about this evening, and I read the book twice, and I was telling Diane I was connected to this story years ago. It was when, I believe, one of the two funerals that we had for Jim, and I can remember myself standing at the window in the dining room of my residence, and just mesmerized and caught with the story of Jim, the funeral that was going to take place that day. And there was another connection to the priest who was doing the funeral. I know him, I know his brother, not many brothers, Paul and Mark. So that connection I had too with them. So it's just been a story that I've been connected to. And then when the book was published, again, it drew me closer to that story of Jim. And I mentioned to Bob after it was published, we might get her here. So we did. So it's just been a wonderful journey having you here, Diane, and it's a great opportunity for all of us. It's a privilege to gather tonight, to listen, to learn, and to be challenged by a story that is at once deeply personal and profoundly universal. So we're honored to welcome you, Diane, and her husband, John, sitting down here in front. Her husband, great to have you here, John, as well. Who's witnessed both of your love, courage, and faith has touched people around the world. Diane has shared with me, she's been to Europe a number of times, and Europe has really caught on to this story, to Jim, and also to this book, American Mother. You know, Diane is the mother of James Foley, who was an independent journalist who gave his life in pursuit of truth, believing deeply in the dignity of every human person, and the importance of telling the stories that others might never hear. In the face of unimaginable loss, Diane has chosen a path not of bitterness, but of compassion, advocacy, and hope. What beautiful themes, I thought, in connection to these last days of this Lenten season as we approach Holy Week and Easter. Her book, American Mother, is more than a memoir. It is a testament to a mother's love, a spiritual journey to grief, courageous call to encounter even those we might consider enemies within our humanity and grace. In its pages, as I read it, Diane invites us into her heartbreak, but also into her healing, offering a vision of mercy and reconciliation. It challenges the way we see justice, suffering, and one another. Again, powerful things to remember, especially in the day and age we are living in. So tonight, we're not just here to hear a story, we're here to be invited to a deeper way of living, one marked by empathy, moral courage, and a commitment to the dignity of every human life. So please join me in a warm welcome to Diane and her husband.
Thank you so much, Father Tim. That was beautiful. Telling the kind of graceful weight of this story is what we're about tonight. It's the story of Jim Foley. It's the story of the Foleys. And like any beautiful story, like any great story, with its inspiration, with its honesty, with that empathy, compassion, a yearning to spread some sort of sense of love, even with our enemies, it becomes our story. As Father Tim says, it's inspirational, but it calls us into this story and its powerful meanings and themes and the feeling of grace that runs through it. Diane, John, the Foleys, what they have gone through and what they've done with tragedy is just remarkable. It's extraordinary. To give you a kind of a timeline, a sense of the parameters of this story, before I begin to ask Diane to speak of it, Jim, of course, had this passion for journalism. He wanted to go out and find other people's truths, to hear the voices of people that aren't heard otherwise, and to come back and tell their story. Widening the human family in story. Story is what stitches us all together. It's what holds the world together. Jim was, as a journalist, embedded in the Indiana National Guard and the U.S. Army. Went to Iraq, Afghanistan, Kuwait, covering what was happening over there, talking to all people, and telling their stories, getting bylines, writing for Stars and Stripes. He came back from Afghanistan to the United States, ended up in wondering how to get back into the game, and ends up as a freelance journalist in Libya in 2011. He was covering stories there and was captured by Muammar Gaddafi's men, held for 44 days, and was eventually released and came back home. From there, he wanted to get back into telling people stories. Ends up probably the worst conflict, worst place a journalist, most dangerous place a journalist could go, and that is Syria. In 2012, he was covering stories there. He was raising money to get an ambulance for the civilians and their injuries. And in November of that year, he was kidnapped by members of ISIS and held for 2 years, tortured. You can imagine the family back home waiting. And in 2014, he was brutally executed he was beheaded in the Syrian desert by ISIS. It was recorded and put up on YouTube. This is how America found out. It was meant to be a message to America. 7 years after that, Diane sat down and talked with one of the ISIS members who was responsible for her son's death in a Virginia courthouse as part of a plea agreement. And I just want to take us to that table in the first words of Diane's American mother. She wakes in the hotel dark, a scattering of streetlights through the thin curtains. There, in the distance, Washington, D.C., city of light, truths, half-truths, double truths, lies. One sure truth, her son is 7 years gone now, and this morning she will sit with one of his killers. My first question to Diane is, we take us through the story in your experience from the time that Jim began to realize his passion for journalism, going to these places, his incarcerations, his murder, and then what brought you through all of that to this, sitting across the table from this Alexander Cote and talking to him, human being to human being. And maybe first just begin with, Jim as a journalist and what got him into these dangerous places. And let's go with Jim through that journey.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for coming here, and thank you so much, Bob and Father Tim. It's really an honor to be here. And I'm really a parent, a mom, the mother of 5 children, a grandmother. We have 8 grandchildren now. And Jim was the oldest of our 5. And to be honest, John and I were delighted when he found journalism, because it took him a while to figure out what he wanted to do. He tried teaching, and then he wrote, he did creative writing, and then finally he found journalism. And we were delighted because it kind of merged his love for writing and interest in people's stories. He was truly interested in other people's stories. And so we were delighted that he had found journalism, but I was clueless about the dangers of journalism. And I knew nothing about hostage taking or any of that sort of thing. So it really has been quite a journey for us. It's been now 11 years. And really, I was telling Bob that when I was in Rome recently, you know, I spoke about the way of the cross because I think our church is so rich in the way our church has so many ways it ministers to us. And for me, the way of the cross is one of them, because I think it talks about the injustice of our Lord being condemned to such a horrific death himself, when in fact he was so innocent. And in many ways, that's the way I felt about Jim. I mean, you know, he had gone there to tell stories so that we might have compassion for the suffering of the people in Syria. And then he was targeted and really suffered for 2 long years before he was killed. So it was shocking to us when he was murdered. It was a huge shock. I had quit my job and begun trips to Washington to try to find ways to raise awareness and advocate for Jim's return. And so when he was, nobody expected, none of us expected such a horrible end for Jim. So I was really very angry at our government, to be honest, because Jim was held with about 25 journalists and aid workers from a good part of Europe, the States, and the United Kingdom. And all of the European hostages came home, were freed, negotiated by their government. But our government and the British refused to negotiate. So all of our folks died. They were all murdered. So I really felt our country could do better for when our innocent citizens are targeted abroad like that. But it was a very difficult time. But I definitely leaned on my faith in God, a merciful, loving God that never left Jim and really has sustained me throughout.
Yeah, a lot there, and so much that you talk about in the book regarding that. You talk a lot about journalism. We grew up, you know, with the Walter Cronkites and the Murrows and Ted Koppels, and you realize when Jim's getting into the business, so to speak, it's a different sort of thing. You believe that there was protection for journalists out there. That clearly wasn't there. Jim was actually motivated by going to places that weren't being covered in a way that they should have been covered. And in fact, you say that Jim listened to others' truths. That's what lit up his life, uncovering the humanity in the most inhumane situations. So he knows he's going into danger, but he's taking the risk anyway. And in fact, he had already been taken in Libya. Was held for 44 days. Came back and he said, the first thing that's lost in war is the truth. And it's the truth that he wanted. Could I ask you, how did you feel when Jim came back from Libya? Your son is home, he's safe. And then he says, you know, Mom, Dad, I'm going to this hellhole, Syria, and I'm going to cover stories. As a mother, that had to be a very difficult moment.
Well, he didn't actually tell us where he was going.
That's how he got away with it.
He didn't really tell us a lot. Jim was very good at interviewing us, trying to find out how we were when he was gone. Very short on giving us details details about what he planned to do. But he had found his passion, without a doubt. And it was miraculous when he came home from Libya. It really was through a private citizen and friends of his who researched how to reach into Gaddafi's family and get him released. So that was miraculous. But John and I never expected that to happen again. We thought that was the worst that could ever happen. But Jim really made it very clear that he had found his passion. And I think that's one of the hard things with us as parents at times. You know, we have to let our kids go. You know, we have to give them wings, if you will, at a certain point in their life. And there was no telling Jim what to do at that point.
Yeah, he had said, Mom, I have promises to keep. And your reaction, or what you say in the book is, you know, talking to yourself, hold your tongue, watch your loved ones go. And this is, of course, something that we, you know, all of us, certainly with children, it's, okay, they have their passion, and they have their talents that they want to spend in the world. Is a beautiful thing, but it's a dangerous world.
It can be. For sure.
And something even worse happened, of course.
And I think one of the things that's, you know, when Jim came home from Libya, it really was miraculous. He came home just in time for his baby sister's graduation. So it was just kind of a really amazing gift to have him home. And after that, he went on a bit of a gratitude tour, thanking a lot of his friends around the country who had really helped to bring him home. And he spoke at his alma mater, Marquette University in Milwaukee, and he talked about how he really aspired to be a man of moral courage. I thought, I had never thought about moral courage, to be honest, but that was something Jim aspired to. And he said that to really be a true journalist, that one needed to dare to speak truth to power, to really dig for the truth and make sure that dare to print that or talk about it. And he gave me a lot to think about. So after he finally, you know, when he was murdered, after I started to recover, his courage really inspired me. It really challenged me to not just leave it there. Jim was too full of life and optimism to let his spirit die in that way. So with the help of a lot of his friends, really, and you know, it's funny when bad things happen, I don't know if you've experienced, my experience was that that's when a lot of best people stepped up. You know, friends and family, church, but also strangers, completely people we never heard of before, called and showed up, helped us start the foundation, helped us try to find a better way for our government to deal with when innocent Americans are targeted abroad. So it's Jim and the Holy Spirit has really challenged me, for sure.
You know, the case of when the point in our lives where our children start raising us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And you followed, and you have taken Jim's legacy on, and you're doing, in fact, so many things that you've accomplished, that you've done, you know, in this way, in his name. You say this is something that Jim would have done.
I think so. I think we really tried to think, what can we do that would make a difference for others? And so when we started the Foley Foundation, we realized we needed to kind of challenge our government to really care about Americans who are going out in the world as journalists or diplomats, educators, whatever, that if a government or terrorists targeted them, that our government ought to have some process. when we were going through this with Jimmy, our government kept telling me Jim was their highest priority. But it really wasn't true at that point in time, because our government chose not to negotiate to help him come home. So that really bothered me. So that was something that the Foley Foundation set out to help with. And so since then, nearly 200 innocent Americans have come home, which is something that gives me joy, because I think that's one of the things Jim would have wanted, would have cared for that to happen.
Yeah.
And also we've worked hard to protect journalists who are covering dangerous stories.
And we were talking today most recently, Dennis
Colum just
was just released by the Taliban, and the foundation had a role in that as well.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's always a big joy whenever anyone comes home like that.
Well, you're under almost unimaginable stress for these 2 years when Jim is gone. And you're getting all sorts of love and you know, people coming to try to give you solace during this time. Pope Francis called.
Well, this was after Jim's murder.
After his murder, yeah.
Yeah, during Jim's captivity for those 2 years, those were very lonely years. Those, thank God for our church community.
And you're dealing with a government that is actually not only not helping, but is somewhat hostile in that they, 3 times they threatened to prosecute you if you raised money to try to get Jim home.
Exactly. So it was a very difficult time. But after Jim was murdered, the outpouring of love was incredible. I mean, Pope Francis called us one day. I just couldn't believe it. My brother-in-law, who speaks Spanish, happened to be there, and so that was very beautiful because he was able to easily translate too. But we were so touched because Pope Francis's nephew had just been in a car accident recently at that time. He didn't know us from Adam, and yet he reached out from Rome, called us to offer his condolences and to say Jim was a martyr. It just meant so much that, you know, he called us. Before our president called us, he called us. So it was really very, very beautiful.
You know, speaking of beauty, this is the Diane that I've come to know, and I've been privileged to come to know. When Pope Francis called, at least in the book, as you and Colum write it, you expressed your condolences for his nephew and losing his wife and children in an accident. And it seemed like Pope Francis said, yes, thank you very much, but that's not why I called. You know, but your impulse toward empathy clearly is, you know, Jim's passion. And a lot of folks I've been talking to are wondering, with this faith that Jim had, that you have, this wanting to make the world a better place, to tell the truth, to serve, where did that come from? You know, was it certainly a lot of influences, but you know, it's a wonderful exchange. Your other 4 children are, you know, serving. You know,
well, we're not perfect family.
Oh,
I wouldn't have think that.
I'm sorry, I crossed that line.
No, far from that. I think what is amazing is what God can do with all of us ordinary people. I'm an ordinary mom. I was a nurse. Jim was a wonderful but ordinary guy. I mean, he loved to read. He was a lot of fun. He was a good friend, but he was often late. He wasn't a perfect athlete. There was something he wasn't a perfect
Gave
person.
really bad interviews for jobs.
There you go. I mean, Jim was, but I think it's amazing that we all have choices every day. You know, we have choices in how we deal with people, with situations. And I think Jim was always, particularly after he Jim always wanted to try to do the right thing. He was a good listener. So I think he learned a lot because he was a good listener. And he cared. And then he went to Marquette, where they really stressed be the difference. And
be a person for others.
Yes, be a person for others. And so from the time he was a freshman, they had him out in the inner city tutoring the kids and that sort of thing. And so he was called to do that kind of thing a lot. And like I say, it's Jim who's challenged me. I mean, I'm just a mom. And, but I think it's amazing the Lord calls us at different times in our life. And it's up to us to say yes, you know, and to pray for the courage to try to do what we're asked to do, you know. And then so that's been my experience, you know. It's just, God knows we're ordinary people.
Well, you know, that's one of the inspirations of the story is that, you know, the temptation is to say, oh, and so many people have said this to me, I could never do what Diane did. You know, she must be very special, you know, a person, you know, endowed with this courage and this faith. But you say Jim was ordinary, and in fact, in some interviews, you even talk about his goofy nature, you know.
Oh, that's funny.
You know, and you say, you know, in the book, you know, people call you a saint. No, I'm just a mother. But then you say, but that's enough. and there isn't anybody who. But how would you speak to? You say, I'm just a mother. I'm ordinary. Jim was ordinary, but you've done extraordinary things. How? Part of it is certainly involved in the faith that you're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. I think God challenges us to love, right? He challenges us to forgive. He challenges us to walk in faith. I think I've been gifted from the time I was really quite young that our God is a God of incredible love and mercy. But he does challenge us. I mean, he really wants us to make a difference in the world. And it's not easy. I don't think it's possible without the Holy Spirit, without the goodness of others encouraging us. And that's why the words we use, John and I we love Matthew Kelly. He's one of the spiritual writers that we enjoy a lot. One of our recent pastors would give us books at Easter and Christmas, and one of them recently is this little book called The Forgotten Way, it's called. And it's all about how we use our speech, words, for good or for bad. You know, how we can lift people up with the good things we say and encourage them and really help them to dare to do the right thing, or we can put people down and make them feel they can't do anything. You know, so often God challenges us in little ways and big. Now, obviously, this was a big way the Lord was challenging me. But I think it's similar to the many small and big ways we're all challenged, really. We all are challenged, right? All of us.
One thing that I would, you know, faith isn't a free ride.
No.
There must have been doubt, there must have been anger. You talk about, you know, when Jim was first taken, the sense of bitterness, I think, is you use that. Certainly the government. But people are curious too, because we probably naturally feel that way. Was there doubt along the way? Was there anger at you know, the God that you prayed to?
Well, I think one of the hardest times was during those 2 years. I quit my job so I could start going to Washington to try to advocate for Jim. But I didn't know what I was doing, really. But I definitely prayed a lot, and I was actually doing the spiritual exercise of St. Ignatius, the 14th annotation, which means you go once a week, and then every day do the prayer and the exercises. But anyway, so that was very helpful. But after nearly 2 years, I was exhausted and very discouraged. And I actually remember going to we had a little adoration chapel in our church, and just saying, I give up. I just surrender, Jim. I just have no idea what else to do. I just don't know what else to do. I felt so powerless. And actually, Jim was killed 2 weeks after that. It was kind of like, I mean, you know, that's not what I meant when I surrendered Jim.
Well, yeah. And you found out I mean, horror upon horror, the most horrific way.
Yeah, I did, actually, yeah. It was by a journalist calling us to tell us that, yeah, it was a very difficult time, but I really felt the most angry at our government, mainly because our government had promised me and told me over and over that Jim was their highest priority, and had sent me in circles, really, and really not told me the truth. So I was.
There were some good folks in there, but by and large, the institution really betrayed you.
Well, there was no one accountable
Yeah.
to bring Jim home. So.
And there was no real thought or system in place
None.
to deal with this, even though it's been a problem for decades. And I guess it goes back to Nixon, where politically it just was kind of written in stone in Washington that we will not negotiate with terrorists under any circumstances at all.
And but that was my cluelessness. I didn't know anything about the policy. And so when they told me Jim was their highest priority, I just believed it. I trusted it for much too long.
And, with the horrific thing that happened to Jim, ISIS had him read this, you say, vile message to America before they killed him. The ISIS member who wrote that message that Jim was forced to read was the one sitting across the table from you when you went to that Virginia courthouse. You can have, I would think, my first reaction would be, I can have all the faith in the world, and still, there's a number of things that I think most people would at least impulsively think, let the guy rot in maximum security prison for the rest of it. Don't dignify, as you say, your friends were saying, don't dignify him, with your presence, even with your rage. And yet, you walked up to that table and Colum told Anderson Cooper, you said, hello, Alexander, it's a pleasure to meet you. And you're facing this person who had been torturing your son for 2 years, and you sat down and talked with him for hours. What happened in that? What did you learn? Did it strengthen your faith in this process? It certainly was a challenge to you.
Oh, well, I could be rather impulsive and curious. And I think Jim was a very curious kid, certainly when he was little.
You said Jim would have done this.
Jim would have done it. Jim would have wanted to know why this young man whose family had sought refuge in the United Kingdom and were given refuge, why this intelligent young man had become radicalized and had such hatred towards Americans and Westerners in general. So it was kind of, I knew Jim would have wanted to know why, want to hear his story. Why would he feel that? Why would he hate us? And the other part of it, as a mom, I wanted to tell him who Jim was, because I don't think he realized that Jim was a non-combatant, as were the other journalists and aid workers. They were there to bring those stories home or to help the people who were suffering in Syria. So that was the idea when I went, but nobody wanted to go. And as it got closer, I was kind of nervous about it.
Your friends and family were kind
They
of
thought
saying,
it was stupid.
Diane, stop us. Yeah.
They thought it was right. And as it got closer, I started to get cold feet myself. no one wanted to join me except Colum McCann, who'd become a friend at that point. He was curious too, and he said, "Do you want to go? I'll go with you," kind of thing. But then as it got closer,
And Colum was in the room.
yes, Colum definitely came with the accompaniment. But I remember having to pray a lot as a mom to see this young man who is the same age as one of our younger sons, to see him as a person who's made horrible mistakes like we all do. And so I really had to pray for that grace to be able to see him as love.
And you thought that this was important because Jim would have done it, but you had the impulse. You thought it was important that it be done.
Oh,
And that
yeah,
you were the person that was going to do it. Yeah, you spoke to him as a human being. You asked him questions like, what do you regret? What did you think of my son? Which I thought was just a beautiful question to ask him. And he began to kind of, his sort of hard exterior began to fall away a little bit. He showed emotion. He wept.
towards the end, or the second day particularly. And it was odd, it was kind of a grace-filled moment. Never expected that. But, it's amazing what can happen when you invite God in, and listen to someone else. And, it was sad. I mean, essentially because of the mistakes because of what he chose to do, he'll never see his own family again. Probably never his own country again, for that matter. And that's just, in many ways, we have to hold people accountable when we do horrific things, certainly. But it was just a very sad encounter all around.
You said so many beautiful things, powerful things. You told Cote in another life, you and Jim might have been friends. Getting him to imagine,
Yeah, I don't know what he thought about that, but Jim loved to befriend kids who were having a hard time, who didn't fit in, or really. Jim spent 5 years in Teach for America, teaching kids in the inner city before he found journalism. And he mentored many of those kids until throughout his time as a journalist, actually. So he often kind of was drawn to kids who didn't have a parent or had an incarcerated parent or really had troubled childhood. And I think Alexander had that.
Yeah. And toward the end, you just told Cote, you said that you would keep him in your prayers. And Cote to keep Jim in his. He was religious.
Oh, he very religious, a Muslim, but very much. And, Alexander Cody also had, his defense team had invited this restorative justice person in to work with him. So I think that also gave Alexander an openness and a desire to kind of have some peace with his God too.
Right. A documentary was made of Jim's incarceration, and called Jim, the James Foley story. It's on HBO. Cote saw that. In fact, he watched it twice.
It's odd.
And he was moved by it. And of course, he, at the beginning at least, his answer to everything was, well, it's war. We can kind of hear those drums beat now too, as though that excuses,
exactly.
A recess from decent human behavior. Yeah. Very interesting moment at the end. In the Muslim tradition, men are not to touch any woman except for their wife or children. And when Diane stood up and Cote stood up and they were saying goodbye, Cote actually shook your hand. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you said what you said. Colum McCann stayed in the room knowing that this was a violation of his religious tradition. He said, why did you do that? And Cote said to Colum, because she's a mother to us all. If you can imagine how you go from, you know, what these guys were doing, what Cote was doing in the Syrian desert, to that moment of some sort of reconciliation, some sort of beautiful moment, beautiful human moment out of all that ugliness.
Yeah, God was present. Absolutely. Yeah.
And in a real practical way, actually within a few weeks of Jim being taken in Syria, you started a foundation.
Yes, actually, you know, after Jim was killed, it was just kind of like, you know, it was just, Jim was always such an optimist, and he always found something good out of anything bad, you know, so that's when his friends and I, we just decided we had to try to do something good. We started receiving buckets of mail. We received mail from all over the world for a year. It was incredible. The love people poured out on us, really. And many people sent donations, and we thought, well, what are we going to do with this? And that's when we decided to start the Foley Foundation to help bring fellow Americans home and work to protect journalists. Yeah. It seemed pretty clear at that point.
Well, you've got a wonderful crew working with you. I've been privileged of meeting a lot of them, working tirelessly.
Yeah.
So if this happens to someone, I mean, what would you recommend? I mean, as Sting wrote a blurb for the book. He said this book will shake your soul out. And he wrote a song, The Empty Chair, for the documentary.
He did.
Yeah. You know, he says, you know, anything can happen to any one of us. And even this, when Jim was taken in Libya, he said, well, it can't get any worse than this. And then it did. So if this were to happen to someone, what would your advice be?
Well, the good news is after Jim was killed and we, you know, began advocating for fellow Americans in this situation. And so President Obama really realized he had to do something, and he really did a comprehensive review and established the current U.S. hostage enterprise that has brought home nearly 200 innocent fellow Americans. So Dennis Boyle was one of the most recent. So that's been really awesome. And you know, journalists have realized, schools of journalism, that we need to teach journalists how to keep themselves safe. Because if they really want to dare to tell us the truth, it isn't often whatever, some people don't want that. The truth can be silenced or suppressed. So we've done a lot of work with that.
Especially in this day and age when, you know, we have a lot of people in our government calling the press the enemy of the people.
Right.
This is hugely dangerous because what happens, you know, to the truth, you know, that Jim was looking for, that all great journalists are looking for, is to tell these stories. You know, we're not going to like, you know, the themes of a lot of these stories, but we need to know that it's true, it's happening out there. And if that's suppressed and we become deaf to the truth.
Well, it threatens our freedom. Because then we don't really know what's happening, right? So it's been quite a journey, but a real privilege and a way to keep Jim's spirit of goodness alive. It really has.
This is his legacy.
Yeah. So that's been a real joy to me, and I invite any of you you to learn more about what we do. I've got brochures downstairs. We do research and work with families who have a loved one who is targeted abroad and held hostage. We work very closely with schools of journalism. As a matter of fact, I'm going up to Syracuse University tomorrow to speak with them in the journalism school there, so that our journalists can, be prepared to face whatever they have to keep us informed. But
Right, I just wanted to, we'd like to hear from you and your questions. I just thought, because I began with the beginning of the book, this scene, I think, wraps it up, and it's you in Washington, going to do your fine work with the foundation. Diane, at the end of the book, gets into a cab, and there's a woman driving the cab named Elizabeth. And of course, Diane being Diane, the first thing she notices is that Elizabeth has pictures of children in the cab. And Diane says, "Oh, are those your children?" Begin talking about her children. A beautiful kid, she says, as she adjusts herself into her seatbelt. "Thank you, where are we going?" "We're on our way to Congress, Elizabeth." The car pulls slowly out into the light. It's a 20-minute journey to the city she knows. She leans back against the seat and for a moment closes her eyes. All her life, a long attempt to close her eyes and rest. But she shook his hand, Cotes. She made that gesture, and he received it. Everything good, once begun, lasts. Nothing ever truly ends. Including the story, and you are all in it now. We're in this story. It's not over. On we go to do good, tell the truth.
Well, exactly. And I'd love to hear your questions, to hear what you might be thinking, or we've just tried to touch on some parts of my 11-year journey, but I'd love to hear if any of you have specific questions about...
Why don't we do that?
How did you get to forgiveness?
Well, forgiveness is a process. I mean, I didn't go out thinking I was going to forgive or anything particular. I just was trying to be open to hear, to listen, and Alexander expressed a lot of regret over the 3 days I spoke with him, and actually sent me several letters months later. So I really think it was a process, certainly with the Holy Spirit and time, and certainly nothing instant, but something I think we're all called to for healing ourselves too. None of us are at peace when we're filled with anger or resentment. So, that's a great question.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Oh, all sorts of people. It's great. We're glad to have them.
So at this time of the year, I think sometimes about Virgin Mother, when Jesus was walking up the mountain to be crucified, and her son had been tortured for so long, and I thought, how can she do that? And I thought maybe the answer is she just gave it up to the will of God. And on page 153 of your book, the week before your son's execution, you said, I was exhausted and I just decided I have to give it up to the will of God. And so I was wondering if you feel a special affinity for the Blessed Mother, having gone through a very similar experience that she did.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. And I think that's really in many ways what's so beautiful about our faith. I think our church gives us these images that we can relate to. And definitely the Blessed Mother. absolutely. I mean, love carried her through all that, really. Love has an amazing power. You know, God's love, the love of others. With that, we can do anything, you know, and I definitely feel that. And I just, as I was saying in the Way of the Cross, there's a lot of that about when people treat us unjustly, or when we carry heavy burdens, or when we try to help one another on our journeys, you know. But definitely, yes. The Blessed Mother has been a huge solace for me, and a model for me of how to walk in faith and love, to aspire to that.
I was just thinking of how fortunate your other kids are to have parents like you and your husband. And if you want an extra kid, I'll sign up. But I'm just wondering how your kids are doing.
Well, you know, to be honest, I don't think it's been easy on our 4 younger kids, because I did throw myself into the foundation, a lot of this work, which, you know, for a while, particularly the middle kids kind of resented it. So it was my path of healing. I really kind of needed to do this, but I've had to really work hard and balance, and recently we actually moved closer to our family so we could be, you know, really make sure we're spending enough time with our children and grandchildren. Because I think that's one of our challenges too, as we get older and our kids have flown the coop, but nevertheless they may want us, you know, to be present, certainly be part of their lives as such. So it hasn't been easy for Jim's siblings, you know, and particularly for the ones in the middle. I think they've come around and they've come to understand this was part of my journey, just like they've, you know, had to grieve in a different way. You know, we all grieve differently, really, and we've had to respect that, but it hasn't been easy for them, you know. We do an annual run every year, and that's been something the family enjoys and such. But some of the things the family hasn't liked particularly, it's been hard on them.
But you still want to jump in.
I have a question, I don't know if I missed it, but the gentleman that was part of the responsibility of your son's death, how was he captured, and is he in prison in the United States?
Well, there were actually 3, there were many people responsible for hostage taking. I mean, they kidnapped hundreds of people and raised ransom and raised money for their terrorism and all that. But there were 3 British jihadists that were particularly dealt with the English-speaking hostages. And one of them, who actually killed Jim, was killed with a drone, was just killed. But these 2, Alexander and El-Shafi El-Sheikh, were actually apprehended with Kurdish forces who were helping the U.S., and they identified them. But it wasn't easy to extradite them to Virginia. That wasn't easy. It required a lot of collaboration with the United Kingdom and with other hostage families. It was quite a process. They were apprehended in 2018, but didn't come to trial until 2021 or 2. So it took a while. And it was quite a process. But I was very grateful they came to Virginia, because they received everything that Jim and the others did not. They had 4 attorneys, defense attorneys, and you know, it was a very fair trial, if you will. And a shining time for our Department of Justice. The FBI worked for 8 years building a case. And yes, these two men are, will serve life in prison, for all they did.
In
Not
maximum,
just-
maximum security
Yeah.
prison in Colorado.
Sting was so right. I mean, virtually every page shakes you to your core. But for someone that started out without understanding how government works, and you made an incredible dent in what our country does. And
Well, you learn fast when it has to do with your own, right? You learn fast, and I think it also tells us that as citizens, we have power. I mean, we can stand up for what we believe. Our voice matters, our vote matters, and I think understanding what's going on in our country is important, so we can stand for what we think is important. Like your pastor, Father Tim, I think he's a good example of trying to keep all of you aware of what's going on and to try to make stand for what you value as Christian Catholics, or as Christians or people in the world, what you want our country to be. I think we do have a voice, and I think we need to use it.
what we want our country to be, I think you captured that. I'm looking at page 167, this sentence. There are a lot of currencies in the world, but there's none as precious as a human being. I mean, if we were to look and establish our policies, what we do with hostage situations, what we do, whether we go to war or we don't go to war, how do we treat people who are in power? And we looked at it from that formula that you wrote there. I mean, we ought to, before Congress or the President decides to do anything, or any of us in our own life, we should ask ourselves, how does that how a human being? And be able to weigh that in a serious manner. And
Well,
I think you captured that you need to be our president.
I just think we're all called to that kind of moral courage, Dennis. And it isn't easy, but I think this is a time in our country where we all do need to pray and to really seek to love one another and try to aspire to our country to be the best it can be, in terms of caring about people, caring about one another. I totally agree with you, Dennis. Yeah, it's a challenge, but I think it's something we're all called to.
A couple of the questions that I wanted to ask you tonight were answered by this beautiful brochure. I had a question about your foundation, and a great idea. I noticed that from the brochure that you started the foundation within 16 days of Jim's death. And the other thing that, can you hear me all right?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm just listening.
But the other thing that you put together in order to challenge the policy of the government to not pay ransom, not to interfere with that process, either militarily or financially. But in any case, you collected some expert people and some government people to research how you could change the policy. And,
Well, we thought that was really important because it bothered me that our government chose not to negotiate when the research really showed that if they didn't, well, then all of our Americans would die. That was what the research showed. It was obvious. And so we annually do research with hostage families, returned hostages, government officials, to make sure that we're on track to be doing, at least in our little niche, what we can do to serve these families. And, I mean, some folks who've returned from 8 years in captivity are asked to pay taxes for those 8 years, for example. Things like that we might not even think about, but, but happens, so crazy stuff. But it's, so we do it every year. We do, because there's always need for improvement and change. So we want to make sure it's based in research.
We've got a question back here, and maybe one more after this. Diane will be downstairs for a good period of time, signing books and talking to all of us, and we should.
Hi, Diane. First, I wanted to say thank you for all that you've done and all that you've shared with all these people around the world. You're an amazing person. I just have a question. My wife and I watched the documentary last night. I have a question from your perspective at the moment. Okay, you joked that when he was going over the second time, that he didn't really tell you where he was going. And in the book, you also mentioned that he would interview you, so he sounds like he could be like me, he doesn't speak a lot about himself. One of the things that really stood out in the documentary is he was like the savior for all the other captives. Everybody was so predominant in all the interviews of how he was the glue, he was the calming force, he provided faith to them. And I would imagine that maybe in a way was surprising to you. I know you loved your son, he was an amazing person, but being quiet, I'm just wondering what your thoughts were seeing that come out about.
It was so reassuring to me, to be honest, because those 2 years, I had no idea. We had no idea what was happening to Jim. In some ways, it was merciful because we didn't know the horror of what was happening. But we prayed constantly for him. I mean, our church did, we did, our prayer groups did. And to know in the documentary, it was kind of cool because that documentary was done by a childhood friend of Jim's, someone who wanted the world to know how Jim lived, who he was, if you will. And Brian captured a lot of the hostages who came home. So that's how John and I knew what happened, kind of, to some extent. But it's really how I knew that God was taking care of Jim, that our prayers were being answered, that Jim was feeling the love, was feeling our prayers. So in many ways, what they had to share about Jim was very reassuring to me, because Jim couldn't have been that good, that loving, without God's grace, really. I mean, like I say, he was ordinary in the best sense of all of us, he was a good person. But in those situations, he was extraordinary. He really was. And I really feel that was due to God's grace and the many, many people who were praying for him. Did that answer the question?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. So that was a gift to me.
Thank you, Diane, for being here. I know this question is going to be clear, so feel free. Do you view your son as a martyr?
Well, Pope Francis said he was, but God will be the judge of that, right?
And concomitantly, when you went through this restorative justice program, as you sat and talked with this other young man, did you see him as having religious
Well,
Does that make sense what I'm asking?
I'm just trying to hear the end of what you said. You said something about Alexander.
Did you view him, or does he view himself as following a religious cause?
A religious call, you said?
Cause?
Cause. Well, yes. I mean, I think he was Muslim, and I think initially he'd been really radicalized and felt that this is what God wanted him to do, to kill Westerners and that. But I think after years in custody and his own prayer, he came to have regret about a lot of what he'd done. And I think it was some of his healing with his God. Because, you know, Islam is also a faith of peace and love and mercy too. You know, he had just, yeah. So, yes, I think a lot of his faith had brought some healing to him, definitely, yes.
Well, thank you, everybody, once again for being here, and Father's trying to finish or wrap things up for us.
Yes, I'll pick up where Joe left off. Thank you very much, Diane. It's one thing to read your book, but it's certainly another way to really hear the book and feel the book through your words and sharing tonight. So thank you very, very much. But just to realize that you invoke the blessing on it today or tomorrow's Feast of Annunciation. And we know those famous words, let it be done to me according to your word. And you have shown how, as she said those words, you said those words, not knowing what it all meant, but you lived them out faithfully. So thank you for showing us that faith, that grace, and what it is to live the gospel. So thank you so much.